My name is Dr. Marcus Chen. I'm 47 years old, and I was a physicist my whole life until last March when I died and woke up in a dimension that shouldn't exist, a place that violates every law of physics I spent 3 decades defending. I have 3 PhDs, published 127 peer-reviewed papers, won the Breakthrough Prize in Fundamental Physics, and spent my entire career proving that consciousness ends at death. I was wrong. Catastrophically, terrifyingly wrong. I grew up in San Francisco, the son of 2 engineers who raised me on logic, reason, and the scientific method. There was no room for superstition in our household. When my grandmother tried to tell me stories about ancestors watching over us, my father would interrupt, "Marcus, there's no evidence for that. When we die, our neurons stop firing, and we cease to exist. That's biology." I internalized that worldview completely. By 30, I was leading a research team at CERN. My entire identity was built on a single foundation. The material universe is all that exists, and everything, including consciousness, can be explained by physical processes. I married another scientist, Dr. Rachel Hoffman, a neuroscientist. We were perfect for each other, 2 minds that rejected anything that couldn't be measured, tested, and replicated. We had 1 daughter, Sophie, now 19, and we raised her the same way: question everything, demand evidence, reject faith-based thinking. From the outside, my life looked like the American scientific dream. I had grants, invitations to speak at every major university, and a team of brilliant researchers. People came to me when they needed the voice of reason to debunk pseudoscience, UFO claims, near-death experiences, consciousness survival theories. I was the skeptic's skeptic. But there were cracks in my foundation that nobody saw, including me. The first crack appeared 12 years ago when Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a colleague at Stanford, began publishing research on near-death experiences. Sarah had been a hardcore materialist like me, but after her own cardiac arrest during surgery, she came back changed. She told me she'd experienced consciousness while clinically dead, observed the surgical team from above, saw things she couldn't have possibly seen. I looked at her research. It was methodologically sound, her statistical analysis was impeccable, and her conclusions were impossible. So I did what any good scientist would do. I tried to destroy her work. I wrote scathing critiques, organized symposiums to debunk her findings, used my reputation to cast doubt on everything she published. The scientific community largely sided with me. Sarah's grant applications were rejected. Conference organizers stopped inviting her to speak. By the time she left Stanford 3 years later, her career was effectively over. I told myself I defended science from pseudoscience. But the truth was darker. I destroyed a colleague's career because her data threatened my beliefs. The second crack appeared 7 years ago during an experiment at CERN. We detected something that shouldn't exist. For 3 consecutive days, we observed quantum coherence patterns that suggested information was being transferred outside our observable spacetime. The particles were behaving as if they were receiving data from somewhere else, somewhere that violated causality. Dr. James Rodriguez, my lead research assistant, was excited. "We need to publish this," he said. "This could be the most significant discovery in a century." But I knew what publishing would mean: ridicule, controversy, my reputation destroyed. "The data's corrupted," I said finally. "We're not publishing anything that suggests particle physics supports metaphysical dimensions." We buried the data, attributed the anomalies to equipment malfunction, and never spoke of it again. But I knew what I'd done. I'd suppressed evidence because it threatened my worldview. The deepest crack appeared 5 years ago when my daughter Sophie, then 14, started asking questions I couldn't answer. It began after Rachel's father died. Sophie had been close to her grandfather, and his death hit her hard. One night, she came to my study. "Dad," she said quietly, "where did Grandpa go?" "Nowhere, sweetheart," I replied. "His body stopped functioning. His neurons stopped firing. He no longer exists in any meaningful sense." "But where did he go?" she pressed. "Everything that made him him, his memories, his personality, his love for us. That can't just disappear." "It can and it does," I said. "I know it's difficult to accept, but consciousness is just neural activity. When the brain dies, that activity ceases." She stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not just sadness, but something close to horror. "How can you live like that? How can you love anyone if you think they just disappear? Sophie, emotional reasoning doesn't change physical reality. You don't know that, she shouted. You're so sure you're right that you can't even consider you might be wrong. She ran from my study, and our relationship never fully recovered. This past March, I was invited to speak at a physics conference in Boston. My lecture was titled, Why Consciousness Cannot Survive Death, a Neuroscientific Perspective. The auditorium was packed, over 400 scientists. I was in my element, wielding data like a weapon. The evidence is unequivocal, I told the audience. When neural activity ceases, consciousness ceases. Any claim to the contrary is wishful thinking dressed up as science. As I spoke those words, I felt a strange pressure in my chest. I ignored it and continued. Near-death experiences can be explained by DMT released during trauma, oxygen deprivation, or false memories. There is no mystery here. There is no other side. There is only, the pain hit me like a freight train, crushing pressure across my chest. I grabbed the podium, trying to stay upright. The conference hall started spinning. Then I was falling, and everything went black. The first thing I noticed was that I was still conscious. That was impossible. My heart had stopped. My brain was being deprived of oxygen. I should have been experiencing nothing, because I should have ceased to exist. But I was experiencing something. I was aware, thinking, observing. I wasn't in the conference hall anymore. I was in a space that shouldn't exist. It wasn't dark and it wasn't light. It wasn't empty and it wasn't full. It was dimensional, but not in any way that corresponded to height, width, or depth. I was perceiving dimensions that don't exist in our space-time continuum, dimensions perpendicular to the four we know. And I wasn't alone. There were consciousnesses, patterns of organized information that existed independently of physical substrate. They weren't ghosts or angels. They were something far stranger. Self-aware information structures existing in a dimensional framework that our physics says cannot exist. One of them focused its awareness on mine. You're the one who thought consciousness couldn't exist without neurons. It communicated, not in words but in direct transfer of meaning. You're experiencing quite a contradiction right now. This isn't possible, I tried to say. Consciousness is an emergent property of neural networks. Without a brain, I can't be experiencing anything. And yet you are, it replied. You're thinking, observing, reasoning, experiencing, all without a single neuron firing. I couldn't argue. Every principle of neuroscience I knew said this was impossible. Where am I? I asked. You're in the space between, it replied. The dimensional framework that underlies your physical universe. Think of your spacetime as a three-dimensional surface on a four-dimensional object. This is the four-dimensional object itself. Before I could protest, they showed me something that shattered every assumption I'd ever held. They revealed consciousness not as an emergent property of matter, but as a fundamental feature of reality itself, more fundamental than matter, than energy, than spacetime. Consciousness wasn't produced by brains. Brains were interfaces that allowed consciousness to operate within the constraints of physical law. I saw it mathematically. The equations were beautiful, terrible, undeniable. But neural correlates, I argued desperately. We can measure exactly how brain states correspond to conscious states. Damage a radio, one replied, and the music changes or disappears. Does that prove the radio creates the music? The analogy was so simple, so obvious, that I felt physically sick. I'd spent 3 decades arguing that correlation proved causation, but I'd ignored the possibility of a transductive relationship. The CERN anomaly, I whispered. The quantum coherence patterns we detected. They were real. Yes, they confirmed. You observed information transfer from this dimension into yours. You buried the evidence because it threatened your worldview. They showed me Sarah Mitchell's research from this perspective. Every single one of her cardiac arrest survivors had briefly entered this dimensional space, had genuinely observed events from a non-local perspective. I saw others, thousands, millions of consciousnesses who'd made the transition from physical existence to this space. Not dead, not gone, but transformed. Still thinking, still aware, still themselves, just no longer constrained by the limitations of operating through a physical body. My daughter asked where her grandfather went, I said. I told her he'd ceased to exist. You lied, they said simply. Not intentionally, perhaps, but you convinced yourself of a falsehood and passed that falsehood on to a child grieving her loss. I saw Sophie's face when I told her death was the end, saw the horror in her eyes. I'd done to her what my father had done to me, replaced wonder with nihilism, replaced hope with cold materialism. Why do we forget this when we're born? I asked. Because knowing would violate the purpose of physical existence, they explained. The physical universe is a training ground where consciousness can develop certain capacities that can only be formed under limitation. If you remembered this place, you wouldn't engage fully with physical existence. Then they showed me something worse. They revealed how my influence had spread. Every student I'd taught materialist dogma. Every colleague whose research I'd destroyed. Every article I'd written debunking consciousness survival. I saw a graduate student, Thomas Wright, who'd had a profound NDE during a car accident. He'd tried to share his experience with me. I'd told him it was a hallucination, suggested he see a therapist. I watched as Thomas pushed his experience away, labeled it false, spent the next decade becoming a materialist evangelist, all while a part of him knew he was lying. I saw journalist Maria Santos, who'd interviewed me for a documentary. She'd asked if consciousness might survive death. I'd laughed and said, "That's like asking if Harry Potter is real." Her segment aired on national television, 43 million views. I saw how many people had used my arguments to justify hopelessness, to reject their own spiritual experiences, to convince grieving loved ones that the dead were gone forever. You had influence, they told me. You used it to spread falsehood. Not because you were evil, but because you were afraid. Afraid. I protested. Terrified, they interrupted. Terrified of being wrong. Terrified of losing your reputation. Terrified of a universe bigger than your equations could describe. So you built a fortress of materialism and defended it by destroying anyone who threatened it. They were right. Every time I'd attacked consciousness research, it wasn't science. It was fear. Sarah Mitchell, I said. What happened to her? They showed me. After I destroyed her career, she'd moved to Oregon, doing therapy work with terminal patients. She helped hundreds of people face death without fear. She could have helped thousands, millions, they said, with her Stanford platform. But you made sure that platform was destroyed. Are you sending me to hell? I asked. Hell, they replied, is when consciousness fully recognizes the harm it caused and can't undo it. We're giving you a choice. The space around me shifted. I saw two paths. You can remain here, they said. Process what you've learned. Eventually transition to other developmental spaces. Or you can go back. Your heart has been stopped for 6 minutes. Brain damage is beginning, but not yet irreversible. If you return now, you'll live. But you'll carry the memory of this place, and you'll be responsible for what you do with that knowledge. I saw the cost. If I went back and told the truth, I'd be destroyed professionally. Every colleague would think I'd suffered brain damage. My reputation would be ruined. I'd lose everything, I said. You'd lose your false identity, they corrected. They showed me a possible future where I returned and told the truth. The ridicule, the rejection, but also students who finally felt free to investigate consciousness honestly, grieving families who found comfort, and Sophie understanding that existence wasn't meaningless. I want to go back, I said. Are you sure? Because if you go back and fail to tell the truth, if you protect your reputation instead of sharing what you've learned, that's a very different category of harm. I understand, I said. Send me back. The last thing I heard was, remember everything. And remember that truth matters more than reputation. I woke up gasping in Boston Medical Center, tubes down my throat, monitors beeping, Rachel's face above me. Marcus, your heart stopped for 6 minutes. 6 minutes that shouldn't have contained any experience at all. But I remembered everything. The doctors expected brain damage. They ran cognitive tests, but I was completely intact, sharper actually than I'd been before. When I was coherent enough to talk, I told Rachel everything. You're going to be destroyed professionally, she said. I know, I replied. But I have to. I spent 3 decades spreading falsehood. The first thing I did when I left the hospital was call Sarah Mitchell. When she answered, her voice was cautious. Sarah, I said, I need to ask for your forgiveness. I destroyed your career. Your research was sound, your methodology was impeccable, and your conclusions were correct. I knew it even then, but I couldn't admit it. I had a near-death experience during my cardiac arrest. I experienced exactly what your research subjects described. You were right about everything. She was crying. Marcus, I've been so angry at you for so long. But now I just feel sad for all the time wasted, all the research we could have done together. I forgive you. We talked for 2 hours and agreed to collaborate on a paper describing my experience. The second conversation was with Thomas Wright, my former graduate student. Thomas, I said, I experienced what you experienced. The consciousness outside your body, the space that shouldn't exist. It was real. You were right, and I was wrong, and I'm sorry I convinced you otherwise. For 12 years, he said slowly, I've carried guilt for lying about my experience. You told me it was a hallucination. So I built my career on denying what I knew was true. I'm asking you to stop, I said. Not for me, but for your students. Thomas took 3 weeks to decide, then published an essay in Scientific American titled, What I Experienced When I Died and Why I Lied About It for 12 Years. His department initiated a competency review. Colleagues distanced themselves. But hundreds of academics reached out privately, sharing their own suppressed experiences. The hardest conversation was with my daughter. I drove to Portland where Sophie lived and asked if we could talk. You told me Grandpa was gone, she said quietly. You told me consciousness ends at death. I was wrong, I said, tears streaming down my face. Completely, catastrophically wrong. And I damaged you by teaching you that lie. Your grandfather's consciousness still exists. Not sitting on clouds playing a harp, but he's not gone. He's in a dimensional space we can't normally perceive, and he's still himself. Sophie broke down sobbing, and I held my daughter for the first time in years. I'm sorry, I told her. For every cold answer, every dismissive response, every time I chose my certainty over your need for meaning. I forgive you, she whispered. But Dad, you have to know how much damage you caused. Not just to me, but to everyone who trusted your authority. I know, I said. I'm spending the rest of my life trying to correct it. Rachel and I collaborated with Sarah on a paper titled Consciousness Beyond Neural Correlates, a physicist's near-death experience. We submitted it to Nature. They rejected it. Reviewers called it scientifically unsound. We tried science. Same result. Finally, we published it in an open-access journal. Within 6 months, it had over 2 million downloads. Within a year, it was the most cited paper in consciousness studies. Half the scientific community assumed I'd suffered brain damage. The other half was secretly relieved. Conference invitations dried up, grant applications were rejected, the department chair at MIT suggested I take early retirement. But other things happened too. A graduate student approached me crying. Dr. Chen, my mother died last year. You were on television saying consciousness ends at death. I believed you because you had 3 PhDs. I've been suicidal ever since. But now you're saying she might still exist. I'm saying I was wrong before, I told her. Your mother isn't gone. She's transformed. I watched relief wash over her face. That moment alone made every professional loss worthwhile. 18 months after my cardiac arrest, I founded the Institute for Consciousness Research with Sarah Mitchell as co-director. We assembled scientists willing to risk their reputations. We documented cardiac arrest survivors reporting verifiable details they couldn't have known, observed quantum coherence that lasted longer than physics predicted, detected information patterns that suggested consciousness interfacing with dimensional structures beyond our standard model. We published in open-access journals, presented at conferences willing to host controversial research. The backlash was severe. 3 team members lost their positions, 2 had grant funding terminated. But we also gained support from researchers who'd been secretly investigating consciousness. 2 years after my cardiac arrest, I received a letter from Maria Santos, the journalist I'd influenced. She wrote, Dr. Chen, I watched your interview from 2019 at least 50 times. I used your arguments in my own work. One of those people was my own sister, Isabella, after our mother died. Isabella said she felt Mom's presence. I told her it was grief-induced hallucination. I quoted you verbatim. Isabella became severely depressed. Last year, she took her own life. Her suicide note said she couldn't bear living in a meaningless universe. I helped kill my sister by teaching her your lies. I don't forgive you. But I'm grateful you're finally telling the truth. I called Maria and told her, your mother still exists. Isabella still exists. Consciousness doesn't end at death. Maria was silent for a long time, then said, I want to believe you. Over the following year, Maria became one of our strongest advocates. She wrote a book about her journey from materialist certainty to evidence-based openness that became a bestseller. 3 years after my cardiac arrest, I keynote a conference on near-death studies. The auditorium was packed. I saw Thomas Wright, Sarah Mitchell, Sophie and Rachel, and in the back row, 3 former colleagues from materialist conferences. My name is Dr. Marcus Chen, I began. 3 years ago, I told 400 scientists that consciousness cannot survive death. Then my heart stopped, and I discovered I was wrong about everything. I showed them our research data, the verified perceptions during cardiac arrest, the quantum coherence patterns, the information transfer that violated local causality. A former MIT colleague stood up. Marcus, don't you think it's more likely you experienced a hallucination? Richard, I replied, I've spent 3 years examining that hypothesis. What I experienced was enhanced clarity, expanded cognition, mathematical insights I couldn't have generated with a hypoxic brain, and verified information I couldn't have known. We have 237 cases where at least 3 independent verifications confirm information patients couldn't have known through normal means. The probability of this occurring by chance is less than 10 to the negative 45th power. After my talk, 17 scientists approached me with similar stories, researchers who'd been hiding evidence, afraid to investigate consciousness honestly. That night, we formed the Consciousness Research Coalition, a network of scientists committed to investigating consciousness without materialist dogma constraining inquiry. 4 years after my cardiac arrest, our team made a breakthrough. During a controlled medical procedure, we detected quantum coherence patterns identical to what I'd seen at CERN, but this time we could triangulate the source. The coherence wasn't originating in the patient's brain. It was coming from dimensional space perpendicular to our space-time continuum. We published in Physical Review Letters. Within weeks, laboratories worldwide were replicating our protocol. The evidence was undeniable. Consciousness interfaced with physical reality through quantum processes that originated beyond 4-dimensional spacetime. The materialist paradigm didn't collapse overnight, but cracks appeared. Researchers started publishing openly, journals started accepting consciousness papers, universities started creating consciousness departments. I'm 51 now, 4 years past my cardiac arrest. I lost my position at MIT, my research grants, my collaborations. 3/4 of my former colleagues won't speak to me. But I gained integrity. I gained honest relationships, students free to investigate without fear, my daughter's trust. Most importantly, I gained the ability to face death without fear, because I know death isn't the end. Rachel and I separated last year, not with anger, but with mutual recognition that we'd grown in different directions. Sarah Mitchell became my closest colleague and eventually my partner. We worked together daily, investigating consciousness, publishing research, speaking at conferences. Was it worth it? She asked me recently. Every single cost, I replied. Because I'm not living a lie anymore. I'm sharing this testimony to warn other scientists about the danger of ideological certainty disguised as empirical rigor. I spent 30 years convinced I was following evidence objectively. But I wasn't. I was accepting data that confirmed materialism and rejecting data that challenged it. I wasn't doing science, I was defending faith in material sufficiency. The greatest danger to scientific progress isn't religion or superstition. It's scientists who've become so attached to their models that they reject evidence contradicting those models. To every scientist still defending materialist dogma, I understand why you resist consciousness research. I resisted it for 30 years. But materialism isn't science, it's philosophy, It's a metaphysical claim that might be wrong. Real science means following evidence wherever it leads. I'm asking you to look at the data honestly, not with the goal of debunking it, but with genuine curiosity about what the evidence reveals. To everyone who's lost someone they love, everyone who's been told by scientists like me that your loved one is simply gone, I was wrong. Consciousness doesn't end at death. The people you love still exist. I can't tell you exactly what that existence is like, but I can tell you they haven't simply disappeared. Death is a transition, not an ending. Your grief is real and valid, but it's not total loss. The consciousness that made them who they were continues, and the love that connected you still exists in the fundamental fabric of reality. Sophie, I'm writing this final section specifically for you. You asked me once where Grandpa went. I told you nowhere, that he'd ceased to exist. I damaged you with that answer. I took your natural intuition that consciousness continues and labeled it childish. I taught you the universe was meaningless. I was wrong about everything that mattered most. Your grandfather didn't cease to exist. You were right to question my certainty, right to push back, right to hope for more. I'm sorry it took me dying to figure that out. My name is Dr. Marcus Chen. I died 4 years ago and woke up in a dimension that shouldn't exist according to every law of physics I spent 30 years defending. I came back to tell other scientists that materialism is wrong, consciousness continues after death, and the universe is stranger than our equations describe. I've paid the professional cost for saying this publicly. But I've gained something more valuable: truth. The question facing every scientist is this: are you willing to investigate reality honestly, even when it challenges your fundamental assumptions? I wasn't. I defended materialist ideology for 3 decades, destroying careers and suppressing evidence to protect my worldview. I was wrong about consciousness, about death, about the nature of reality itself. The universe is far stranger than we imagine. And the greatest tragedy would be limiting our investigation because we're afraid of being wrong. I died defending materialism. I came back advocating honest investigation. The choice is yours: defend comfortable certainty or pursue uncomfortable truth. But remember, I thought I had 30 years to get it right. I had 6 minutes. Don't waste the time you have defending lies.